are you?
I am doing great, Bill. How about yourself?
Having a good Wednesday so far, my friend. Really good Wednesday so far. So what did you make of Separation Saturday last weekend at the Pac-12 Conference?
It worked out pretty much the way I thought it would with Utah beating Arizona State. I did think Arizona State might keep it fairly close, and they did. It was 14-3 until Moss got that touchdown with about 5 minutes to go, and then Oregon survived a tough test against Washington, one that Utah's going to be facing next week. Came back, got the victory in that one, so I was pretty pleased with the results.
Utah fans were too, USC fans were, and so were Oregon fans. We'll get to Utah coming up in just a second. What do you make of this Washington team of Chris Peterson? They've lost now 3 games this year.
Yeah, well, coming in, they only had 2 returning starters on defense, and as much as they've been able to replace players in the past, they've been able to replace position groups. Remember, a couple of years ago, they lost 4 second-round draft picks out of the secondary, yet the secondary was still strong. Well, that's because they had a good defensive front 7 in front of them. While they've got talent here, I think this Washington team is talented. They're just not up to the experience and talent level that they've had in recent years. In fact, they're giving up 391 yards per game on defense in Pac-12 play. That's a far cry from where they've been in the past. Last year, for example, 305. And offensively, Jacob Eason has been sort of a inconsistent QB. He had one of his better games last week. He came in with a 2-3 ratio in Pac-12 play, or a 3-4 ratio, I should say, in Pac-12 play coming into that one. Ended up with 3 touchdown passes, no interceptions. So maybe he's on the uptick there as far as Pac-12 play. But they're pretty much. I thought they'd have a little bit of a down year this year, and they have.
Great defensive performance by Utah. When you hold a team in your conference that's ranked right near you to 136 yards of total offense and 25 through the air, it's pretty impressive. What jumped out at you about what you saw from Utah last Saturday?
Lots of pressure on the quarterback. I got to love that. That defensive line finally starting to live up to the potential. While they only snagged 3 sacks, I thought that Arizona State's young quarterback, Jaden Daniels, who's had a pretty doggone good season. He's looked good in most of the games this year. He just struggled with that pressure that he was under for most of the games. So I like the pressure Utah was able to put on, and they didn't have to blitz to get a lot of the pressure. I like the fact the defensive line got that pressure on him and made Daniels have a pretty rough day throwing the football.
He did, and 25 yards on 4 of 18 and the interception as well. You talk about the sack numbers, only 3 sacks, but Phil, he was getting rid of the football because he was running for his life. Sack numbers are good. Quarterbacks or coaches will tell you too. Pressures and getting a quarterback uncomfortable is almost as good as a sack, and Utah did plenty of that.
They sure did, and Arizona State does have a young offensive line. They pulled their freshman tackles at one point, so they're moving it around. But good news for Ute fans, another young offensive line comes into Utah this week.
Yeah, a young offensive line, and perhaps too, Phil, a young quarterback, because the line jumped yesterday from 18 to 21.5 in about an hour. And that, to me, tells me Vegas thinks that maybe that true freshman Brash has to play this week and maybe Monster stays in the concussion protocol.
Yeah, and that could very well be the case. And if you watched Cal's offensive line last week against Oregon State, Oregon State, I think, came into the game with 7 sacks on the season, and yet Oregon State was able to get 9 sacks against Cal last week. And they seem to have trouble adjusting to the different pass rushes that they had. And Spencer Brash is a kid who's, he's got good size, 6'4", 180, but clearly an untested true freshman who would be getting thrown to the wolves. Utah's not a good place to play.
Not especially the way they're dialed in right now. Is there a team in college football that's more lopsided right now from the offensive side of the football to the defensive side of the football? Because as bad as Cal is on offense, they're still really good defensively. They haven't given up more than 24 points in a game to anybody. The defense has really kept them around. It's hard for me to think of a team that's more unbalanced, so good on one side but so bad on the other side.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on the head. I'm scanning right now, going through the teams in the country, and I can't come up with anybody because Cal's offense, as you touched on, is one of the weakest in college football. In fact, they're averaging 90 yards per game, less than what their opponents come in allowing. So if you normally give up 400 yards per game, they're only going to get 310 on you. That's not very good. Number 118 in the country. But as you touched on, defensively, they got some players on that side of the ball. One of the better secondaries in the country, a solid linebacking core. And they can get pressure on you as well. They've got 19 sacks this year, so that's not an easy defense. So they probably are the most lopsided team in college football. I may use that on another show sometime this week, Bill.
Well, there's one of the nuggets that I've given you for the day. I'll probably give you another one before we get out of here. Vegas has this game at 21.5 on the line, but the over-under's only 37.5, Phil. They clearly don't think Cal's going to score many points, do they?
No, they do not. And, once again, watching the Cal game last week against Oregon State, you watch the offensive line, and they were just missing blocks and missing reads, and that doesn't bode well when you're taking on that Utah defensive line. So I think it will be tough for Cal to get any points on the board. The two things Cal's got going in its favor when it comes to that large point spread would, one, be that, as you mentioned, they haven't given up more than 24 points in any game this year, and the second would be, Utah's got a pretty big game on deck against Washington, a team that's sitting there on a bye week right now. So it couldn't help but think there might be a little look ahead in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, we'll see what happens coming up on Saturday. We'll have that game for you right here on ESPN 700. It feels like right now the best two teams in the Pac-12 are Oregon and Utah. As you look at the two, sort them out for me. You've got a little bit more distance from this. I'd be curious to see how you kind of differentiate strengths, weaknesses, who's best, who's second best when you look at Oregon and Utah right now.
Well, let's start with the defensive side of the ball. I'm going to give the edge to Utah up front on the defensive line. I think the secondaries are pretty close. Oregon's got a lot of speed in the secondary. Linebacking cores are pretty close. But overall, I'm giving the edge to Utah based on that defensive line. Utah this year is holding their opponents to 163 yards per game below their season average. Oregon's close, holding them to 97 yards below, but I'm going to give a slight edge defensively to Utah. They've got two very good defenses. Now, offensively, I'm taking Zach Moss over anybody at running back, and he proved last week he could get a little banged up and still come back and be productive. I think he's the best running back on the field, and they rate an edge in that category. Offensive line, I got to give a slight edge to Oregon in this one. The Ducks have one of the top offensive lines in the country, and that quarterback, as good as Tyler Huntley's playing right now, and I'm going to ask you about his health in a minute, Justin Herbert is playing like a first-round draft pick. 21 touchdowns, 1 interception. He's hitting 68% of his passes. So I'm going to give Oregon the edge offensively, Utah the edge defensively, and I think it would make for a heck of a game. Now, I watched Huntley in the second half last week, and he was not the normal Tyler Huntley because he was banged up. How's he doing this week?
Well, they don't let us watch practice, so I can't tell you really, but he did come out and say on Monday that he's playing. So Huntley's a pretty tough dude. So he says he's playing, so I'll take his word for it.
Well, he played the second half, but he wasn't.
He played part of the second half. He came out for a couple of drives. Then they put in Drew Lisk. Then they finally put in Jason Shelley. And I think, he wasn't the same guy because his leg got bent the wrong way on that play late in the first half. He actually went out of the game, went into the medical tent, and on the same drive about 7 plays later came back in the game. But he wasn't able to move nearly as much. And I think from just a safety standpoint, and the way the defense was playing against Arizona State, I think that they thought it was best in that second half to get him out of there.
Absolutely, yes. And the defense definitely made it stick.
No doubt about that. We're talking to Phil Steele here on the Bill Riley Show today. There's not a great schedule of games in the Pac-12 this weekend, Phil. Is there anybody you look at that you say could be on upset alert? Maybe SC at Colorado, maybe Arizona State going down to play UCLA, maybe Washington State going to Autzen Stadium where they've won 4 in a row over Oregon. Any of those smack you as upsets or maybe not so much?
I think the one that first of all, I like the favorites in all those games to win the games. So especially the Ducks in Autzen Stadium. But I think Arizona State has to be a little bit on alert. Remember last year UCLA was sort of dead in the water at the start of the year. Then they won a big game, and they played a lot better in the second half of the year. And Arizona State's a team that seems to play better as an underdog than they do as a favorite. And they're a 3.5-point favorite in that game on the road. I think they'll play well, even though it's at night. I like the Sun Devils. I think they're the better team. But of those three that you mentioned, I think they would be the ones that have the most to be concerned about.
Our friend Phil Steele joins us every week here on the Bill Riley Show just to kind of talk big picture college football and kind of go around the country a little bit. We were talking about Cal a minute ago being so really lopsided, Phil. Hard team to figure out, offense to defense. Well, another hard team to figure out are the BYU Cougars. They're 3-4. They've lost to Toledo and USF, but they've beaten nationally ranked Boise State and nationally ranked USC, plus a win at Tennessee. Kalani Sitake's team's 3-4. They're on a bye week. They've got a tough game with Utah State next week. But how do you rate this team? How do you read this team? Because week to week, they're tough to figure out.
You know, and it's hard for Coach Sitake because, I mean, they're down to their third-string quarterback. And I think that's what cost them against USF. I thought they had the game against USF in control. Then they lost their quarterback, and they ended up losing despite having a 124-yard edge in the game. The Toledo game was an extremely tough situation. I mean, when you open with Utah, at Tennessee, USC, Washington, now you got to go on the road to MAC and play a team like Toledo. Tremendous situation for Toledo, and yet I thought BYU played well. The only game I didn't like the way BYU played was the Washington game. That would be the one game that I think they laid a little bit of an egg in. Everything else, they played extremely good. They're just playing a brutal schedule this year, and I got to hand it to them. I mean, they lost Tyson Williams, their top running back. They lose their quarterback. They lose their backup quarterback, and they're still out there competing and knocking off a team like Boise State. So I like the fight that BYU's showing this year, and they've really been in every game except for that Washington game.
Got to win 3 of their last 6 to get bowl eligible. The game at Utah State's always difficult. The game at San Diego State at the end of the year could be a difficult game. So they've got to find probably those 3 wins in the middle: Liberty, Idaho State, and UMass. Those are 3 very winnable games, aren't they?
Very, very winnable. Idaho State and UMass, extremely winnable. Liberty is on a little bit of a run right now. They've won 5 straight games, but Liberty's not playing anybody. So I think in each of those games, BYU is going to be a double-digit favorite, should win those games, and I believe they will win those games. So I think the bowl will be there for BYU at the end of the year. Now the question is, can they upset a Utah State or can they upset a San Diego State? And both are possibilities. The San Diego State game would come 1 week before the Mountain West title game. So if San Diego State knocks off Fresno, they'll be looking ahead to the Mountain West title game, and that gives BYU another option. I've seen a lot of upsets in that particular week when teams are looking ahead to the conference title game.
Is the best group of 5 team SMU in your mind?
You know, it's quite possible. Right now they're playing that way. They've had the one bad game, and the one bad game for SMU came when they got ranked for the first time since 1984, and that happens to a lot of teams. First time they're in the rankings, and I like the way they're playing defense this year. It's vastly improved on the defensive side of the ball, but that offense with Shane Buechele, the Texas transfer, 18-6 ratio this year. They've got the run game with Xavier Jones. They got Reggie Roberson, the West Virginia transfer receiver. He's averaging almost 19 yards per catch. So this is a very good SMU team. Now, the Memphis game is going to be their tough one, as well as Navy. They got to play both those teams on the road this year. You know, at the start of the year, Bill, I didn't think a single group of 5 team was going to go unbeaten. I thought each one had a loss in there somewhere. SMU would probably be the biggest threat to overturning that, or Appalachian State.
When you look at the top 6 teams, Phil, they're all undefeated. Bama, LSU, Ohio State, Clemson, Oklahoma, and Penn State. How do you sort through who you think the best teams are? Because, you know, LSU, to me, has got the best resume right now. They've beaten teams both home and on the road that are ranked in the conference. I think Bama has the name recognition, but I don't think they've played the schedule yet. Ohio State's beaten the living tar out of everybody, but they've not really played anybody of note yet. They'll get a test with Wisconsin coming up. Clemson's been up and down. They're the defending national champions. Oklahoma got a scare not too long ago. And then, of course, you've got Penn State that's mixed in there too. So as you look at those top 6 teams, the ones that are still undefeated, how do you kind of sort through that in your mind?
Well, I'm gonna take Penn State and toss them out. I think they're going to lose a couple games as the season rolls on here. Last week they got outgained by about 120 yards, got out first down something like 26-14. Still ended up with the win on a drop touchdown pass. So I think Penn State ends up losing a couple games before the season's out. So let's talk about the top 5. I think the team that's played the best this year, the most consistent week in, week out, is clearly, as you mentioned, Ohio State. And they've actually played a pretty decent schedule. If you add up the teams they've played and the amount of wins they have, they've actually, their opponents they've defeated have more wins than anybody else's opponents that they've defeated. And they really haven't shown a weakness. Defensively, allowing 229 yards per game, running the ball 6.3 yards per carry, completing 71% of their passes, and strong special teams, and nobody's even given them a test. So if you base it strictly on how the team's playing this year, you go with Ohio State. As you mentioned, the best resume is LSU, coming out with the big win against Florida. They could pick up another huge win this week against a one-loss Auburn. They already have the win against Texas. So resume, I'm all there with LSU. They've got the quarterback, Joe Burrow, who's my Heisman frontrunner. I'd put him right at the top. Question mark would be the defense. They've had a couple of games this year, 457 yards of Florida, 530 yards of Texas, which are questions. So that would be my question mark with LSU. Now, Clemson, I think, is a team that's getting grossly underrated right now. They keep dropping in the polls. They've had one bad game this year, Bill. That was North Carolina, a game they barely won. But remember last year, they barely got past Syracuse in a game where they needed a late score to come out of there at the win. They're actually playing at least as good as last year. Defensively, they haven't given up 300 yards in a single game. They're holding opponents to 256 yards per game, 49% completions. They're getting after the quarterback with 27 sacks. Offensive line's not giving up any sacks, 5 sacks all year. They're running the football. They've got NTN, one of the top running backs in the country, 6.4 yards per carry. Everybody's questioning him because Trevor Lawrence does not have a 27-to-1 ratio like they thought he would. He's actually got 8 interceptions right now, and that has been the biggest question mark. But if you look at their games, they blew out Georgia Tech. They had A&M 24-3, gave up a touchdown with, 6 seconds to go. Went on the road to Syracuse, beat them by 35. Charlotte, they played 110 players and still won by 42. Led Florida State 42-0. And last week, as much as everybody says they struggled against Louisville, they went on the road and beat Louisville 45-10, and that's a team that played within 18 points in Notre Dame. So I think Clemson's getting underrated. I can't believe they dropped to number 4 in the polls right now. And then Alabama, I've got question marks with Tua. We saw last year after his sprained ankle, he didn't play the same the second half of the year. They need him to come back 100% healthy.
Who's the best one-loss team right now, Phil?
You can make a case for either Oregon or Utah. They're both right up there. You can make a case for Auburn. I think there's a whole lot of Georgia's up there. You can make a case for a lot of those one-loss teams. I don't know if there is. There's still a lot to be seen with what happens there.
All right. Before I let you go, the matchup you're most looking forward to this weekend.
I'm going to have to say one that I'm intrigued by this week is probably Michigan State against Penn State, because you've got a Michigan State team that's off 2 blowout losses, but they're off a bye. It's one of those circle-the-wagon games where this is everything to them. This game is huge. Meanwhile, with Penn State, they just went into Kinnick and came out with a 4-point win. They had a whiteout condition at home and came out with a close win. Now they got to go on and play a third big game in a row and travel against a desperate team at home in a circle-the-wagons moment. That's one that intrigues me the most, because everybody's pretty much projecting all of these top 6 teams to win out. We're going to have a whole bunch of unbeatens at the end of the year, and that's why that intrigues me.
A couple of quick Utah nuggets. Last week, they held the first, and they've got a chance to do this now, the first time they had held Pac-12 opponents to single digits in back-to-back games. 7 against Oregon State, 3 against...
first time since when?
First time in the Pac-12 era. They had never done it to back-to-back Pac-12 teams.
That's surprising, because I always equate Utah with strong defense. So that's really surprising to me.
So the first time they had done that.
You continue to give me these.
Yeah, and they've got a chance really to do it maybe 3 weeks in a row now, because Cal's offense just isn't real good. It was also the first time winning a Pac-12 football game when they turned it over 4 times. 4 turnovers last week for Utah. 2 fumbles and 3 fumbles and 1 interception, and they still won the game. So it was the first time in a Pac-12 game where they had turned it over 4 times and won. It
just shows you how much that the program has advanced. Kyle Whittingham is doing a tremendous job with Utah, and he really has his best team that he's put on the field. So those are 2 really, really interesting nuggets. That Moss fumble really surprised me, because he doesn't fumble very much.
No, and I think some of it had to do with the end of the run and it being a pass play. It's weird. He runs up inside a lot. You don't see him lose the ball, but he kind of got it knocked out from behind. Anyway, Phil, thanks for jumping on board today. We'll talk to you next week, ramping up to that Washington game.
I appreciate it, Bill, and always appreciate the nuggets, my friend. I'm always a little bit smarter when I get off the phone with you.
Try to do my best. Thank you, Phil.